Good day, everyone. I'm Orko Chattopadhyay. I teach in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department in the Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar in India. And I'm recording this video for my friend and colleague, James Martell's class. James is teaching a course, and a substantial portion of that course, I believe, is on Samuel Beckett. And he has already introduced the class to Beckett's fiction, Beckett's early drama, and I'll be talking a little bit about my own interests in Beckett, uh, the work that I've done on Beckett and Lacanian psychoanalysis. I'll also keep in mind what has been discussed so far, as in the texts of Beckett that James has already talked about, and I wish to pick up a little bit on some of those texts to talk about some of my own interests in Beckett. So, my reading of Beckett started way back in 2004 5 when I was an undergraduate of English literature, and I happened to sort of chance upon the trilogy and the early novels. Of course, not after Waiting for Godot. I mean, as the cultural valence would uh, always suggest, if there's one text we read by Beckett, it's more often than not Waiting for Godot. So that's how I started too. But then I kind of gravitated a little bit more towards the fiction. I'll begin by talking about my doctoral thesis, which then went on to become a book. It came out from Bloomsbury a couple of years back. It's called Beckett, Lacan, and the Mathematical Writing of the Real. So, very briefly, I would begin by talking about the book and the interests that were embedded in it, which emerged from my doctoral thesis. So, the project in the book is to look at Beckett's own engagement with mathematical and logical forms in his texts and sort of put that aside, the philosophy of science that we see in the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan's later teachings, especially seminars starting from around 1718 up to seminar 25. We see in late Lacan, I mean, it's not absolutely exclusives to late Lacan. We always see this zeal for mathematization in Lacanian psychoanalysis. At various levels, mathematization sometimes becomes a pedagogic tool to transmit psychoanalysis, as we see in Seminar 17 and the way he maps out certain fundamental discourses and produces mathematical notations for it. We also have an engagement with surface geometry right from the word go, from Lacan's early works, where there's this idea that the unconscious is structured like a language, and this language has a topological structure to it. So he would be using structures like Klein bottle or cross cap or the Mobius strip to show how the inside is also the outside, and how the the psychoanalytic unconscious is like a social surface. It's intersubjective. It's about the subject and the other rather than some depth of the intra-subjective mind. So, taking a departure from a particular strand in Freud's thought, where Freud would think about the unconscious as a depth of the mind, Lacan talks about the unconscious as a social surface and a warped surface. And that's one of the reasons why he goes to mathematics from the beginning. And eventually it culminates into this Borromean topology, which is a particular kind of a knot in geometry, in topological knots. We have a particular knot called the Borromean knot, and he situates the three orders of the unconscious, the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, in the form of this knotting. Now, I say all this because there are similar things in Beckett that I read in this book. And let me very briefly take you through some of these questions. So, for example, in the first chapter, I read Beckett's middle career 1961 novel, How It Is, Comment C'est in French and How It Is in English. And I primarily read this particular question of mathematical formalization in the literary text. Of course, the larger question in the book is the appeal to mathematical discourse in literary modernism and in a writer like Beckett. I mean, can mathematical discourse offer some sort of a structural and discursive autonomy? Is mathematics about representation, or is it more about presentation than representation? What is the efficacy of mathematical discourse for modernist literature? That's one of the larger questions the book asks. And again, I mean, I think it is a book that would be in a certain tradition which has been opened up in the last few years by monographs which talk about mathematics and literature, and very specifically talk about mathematical discourse and its relation with modernist literature. So again, one could think of Bailey's book, Bailey Britz's book, which is about the idea of infinity. Literary Infinities is the title of the book. Nina Engelhardt has also written a book on modernism and mathematics in and around literature. So we have this sort of increasing interest in what can be called a humanities approach to literature. You know, Stephen Connor has written a book on numbers. We have a lot of literature now on numbers, cultural history of numbers, sometimes coming in from anthropologists, sometimes coming in from cognitive linguists. But there's a lot of interest in, as I say, very largely speaking, a humanities approach to mathematics. So that's the large question in the book. Why does, for example, Beckett feel the need to make an appeal to mathematical discourse? And just as I said with Lacan, it's not just the later teachings, it's there throughout his career. We see this in Beckett almost throughout his career too. For example, I think in the class you've already read Murphy. In Murphy, we have a reference to the irrational number. We have a reference to the surds. And almost at the same time as a young man when Beckett was writing Murphy, he was also writing this particular essay about the two needs of literature, Les Deux et Besoin. I don't think he translated this particular text into English. But in this particular text, he, for example, uses a diagram. And what we have is a sort of two overlapping triangles which are inverted in relation to one another, and he sees that as a diagrammatic space to situate the two needs of literature. So he's already thinking about questions of need and desire in and around the discourse of literature, and he's using mathematical diagrammatic models to situate those questions. For example, in this particular little text that I have in mind, he talks about Hippasos as the first martyr of art. Now, going back to Greek antiquity, Hippasos is a figure who goes against the Pythagorean doctrine of the triplet, so to speak. And he is one of those exponents of the irrational numbers. And Hippasos is supposedly killed off because he goes against this Pythagorean rationalism. So from the very beginning, in Beckett's interests to go beyond, to debunk rationalism, we see a certain focalization of mathematics. So mathematics, in an interesting way, becomes a discourse to debunk rationalism, to go beyond the narrowness of rationalism. And we see that in Murphy already, which is interesting, right? So, I mean, it goes to show how Beckett was always interested in mathematics in different ways. So, coming back to the book, in the first chapter on How It Is, I trace this particular dynamic of solitude and company in how it is, and a very complex kind of writing, because how it is about writing, as you know. We have a whole series of almost larva-like crawlers on the mud, and we have a very complex geometry of torture in the book. There's a immaculately organized structure in which every tormentor has a victim and every victim has a tormentor. But the tormentor cannot become the victim of his own victim. And the victim, in other words, cannot torment his own tormentor. So there's a certain structure which forbids this. And we have an infinite straight line in this dark, mud world where all the crawlers exist. In the third part of the book, there's this sort of speculation of an infinite series which is eventually collapsed. And what we have is apparently a kind of return to solitude. So the first part was all about the crawler moving in the mud towards his victim, towards his Pim. All the tormentors are called Bom and all the victims are called Pim. These are generic names in the book. So in the third part, at the end of the book, we have apparently what looks like a cancellation of this entire vision of infinite multiplicity, infinitely multiple crawlers, and a return to the solitude that we saw in part one when the crawler was traveling towards his victim to torment his victim, his Pim. And we see this torment in part two, again through very complex operations of number. So number is another mathematical trope. Now in Beckett's texts, we have various kinds of appeals, as I've said, to mathematics. One is, of course, through the maneuver of number, manipulations with number. We'll see a little bit of this in some of the texts, I suppose, you've already read. But we also see a direct evocation of mathematics. Mathematics as a discipline, or mathematics as a branch of knowledge. We see this in how it is, where every branch of knowledge seems to mark the subject, and quite physically, quite corporeally, because the torment that we have in part two consists of writing with the nails on the body of the other. It's a very bloody, Kafkaesque kind of writing. It's a writing that would remind you of a Kafka short story in the Penal Colony from 1919. So we have this corporeal writing on the body of the other as a sort of part of this tormenting process, which is also a process of erotic enjoyment. It's called stoic love. In any case, I mean, we don't really have the time to recapitulate the entire argument here, but the complex sort of interplay of solitude and company that we see in this book is something I try and situate with late Lacan's purchase on what I just mentioned as the Borromean knot. Because the Borromean knot is a strange kind of non-trivial geometric link that is able to hold both solitude and company. There are three rings there, and there is no one-on-one relation among the three rings, so they are alone in that sense, but at the same time they're also together in one knot formation. So there's a strange way in which we have both relation and non-relation in the Borromean knot, both solitude and company. So this is a form I use or evoke to situate the writing, and this sort of, contradictory writing where one is both solitary and in company at the same time. What we have in Beckett quite often is this antinomic kind of writing. And we see this problematic, in fact, throughout the trilogy, throughout Texts for Nothing as well, which again I'm guessing you are familiar with. Let me put it like this. It's a very complex kind of a dynamic where the subject knows that they are alone. There's no one with them. And yet there's a voice. To use that language from a late text company, a voice comes to one in the dark imagine. To one on his back in the dark, there's a voice that comes. So if I know I'm alone and there's nobody with me, and at the same time, if I'm not able to identify with the voice in which I'm speaking, there remains this very strange contradiction then between I am alone and I am not alone. Both these statements seem to be true. I am alone as well as not alone. And I think this is one of the sort of consistent ontological thesis that we see in Beckett. From company, how it is, from some of the late works, we can derive this, but it goes back in a way to texts like The Unnameable as well, or the texts like Molloy Malone Dies as well, Text for Nothing as well. So there's a certain dynamic of the voice, an unidentifiable voice, and non-assimilable voice. So there's a voice with me and I'm not able to identify with it. So, am I alone or not? Or not alone? So, in a certain way, mathematical form is able to situate this complex, contradictory or antinomic writing of solitude and company. And of course, it's also an ethical writing, because it's about that very complex negotiation between the self and the other. I'll come back to this. So that's one question I try and deal with in the book. The second is this idea I've already introduced through How It Is, but it's there in other works too, and in the plays as well. This idea that the body is a mathematical cipher. The human body is like a mathematical cipher in space. And the way it moves around produces a kind of writing. So motility, human movement, is a form of inscription, is a form of writing. This is something I try and trace through some of the mid-career works, but also the works on love. And I try and connect this idea of motility as a form of writing with love, because we see this in Beckett's text. For example, in Imagination, Dead Imagine, or All Strange Away, or Enough, in some of these texts, these are, in the Beckettian way, love stories. These are love stories in the sense that Beckett ever writes love stories. But, for example, in Enough, we have a very complex geometric description of the two bodies, the bodies of the couple, so to speak. And at one point, as they move around the earth, as it were, the term geodesy is used. Geodesy is again about calculation of movements on the surface of the earth, as it were. We have this in Company too, where the crawling body seems to evoke certain shapes, oblong and rhomboid. These are the two shapes mentioned to talk about the movement of the body. But it's not just the displacement of the body which produces a kind of corporeal geometry in the form of a corporeal calligraphy. We also have what, to use the language of the trilogy, what we could call mental arithmetic. And this is an old question in philosophy, the question of mathesis. It was evoked as early as Kant, when Kant talked about mathesis universalis. Mathesis, or mental counting, is something that humanizes the subject in a way for Kant, and differentiates the human subject from the other non-human subjects. In fact, there's a certain hierarchical humanism at work here, and mathesis is important to situate the human subject in relation to other species, as it were. And How It Is, by the way, does use this language of the species. To come back to the point I'm trying to make here, mathesis or mental arithmetic is something that we see across the trilogy. So, for example, Saposcat, who's one of the characters sort of conjured by the sickbed narration of Malone as he performs his death throughout the novel, Saposcat is someone who is very fond of these mental arithmetics. We see this in company too. When the crawler crawls in the mud, again, this sounds a little bit like how it is, and there are shadows of how it is here. So when the crawler crawls in the mud, he's also aware of how the number of footsteps is going to change. For example, he's aware of each of his movements, and he counts numbers in the mind as he moves. There's this sort of memory in company of these snow walks through the snow. And in these walks through the snow, the walker is always counting his footsteps as well as his heartbeats. And there's a strange way in which large numbers seem to give the human subject a certain kind of company. But at the same time, the complexity is, if the numbers become uncountable, they also produce a kind of anxiety. So numbers are not just emotional company, but they can also be anxiety provoking in Beckett's world. This very complex operation with number is something that I engage with in the book as well. So we have the manipulation of numbers, and again, to go back to some of the examples of this in the early works, if you remember two moments, for example, in Murphy, we have the famous biscuit eating, right? And we have this sort of Beckett's maneuvering with the combinatorial logic, So what is a combinatorial logic? You have three elements, and you want to arrange them in different orders. You can only arrange them according to the law of the factorial, which is 1 into 2 into 3. Okay, so only in 6 arrangements. If there are 4 elements, the maximum number of arrangements would be 1 into 2 into 3 into 4. And we have this sort of inclination, an obsessional inclination in the Beckettian subject in the early works in Murphy, also in Watt in certain ways, and then again in the trilogy, to exhaust the combinatorial. Of course, Gilles Deleuze wrote that famous essay, The Exhausted, and this is one of the ways in which Deleuze talks about exhaustion. So an exhausted person is not able to generate new possibilities because all possibilities are exhausted. So we have this episode in Murphy where Murphy is trying to eat a number of biscuits in the maximal number of ways he can eat those biscuits, given that they are 4 or 5 in number. We have a similar moment in that famous sucking stone episode. 4 pockets, 16 stones. How can Molloy be absolutely sure that each time he's sucking a fresh stone, a stone he hasn't sucked? And again, if we have a sort of a thought process in the narrative that goes into all these combinatorial nitty-gritties and tries to exhaust the combinatorial, tries to maximize the field of the combinatorial. So in Beckett, we always have this manipulation with numbers. I mean, as the famous line goes in the play All That Fall, one of the very few pleasures of life is counting. Both Mr. and Mrs. Rooney kind of know this, that one of the very few pleasures in life is counting. Okay, I'll not talk more about some of the interests in the book, but very briefly take you through especially these wonderful little stories that you've already read, the 4 stories that I know from our conversation between James and I that you've already read. So very briefly, I'll mention just a few things. So in The Expelled, we have this opening where the narrator is talking about the number of steps in the staircase. He's been expelled, he falls through the staircase, and he's now trying to think how many steps there were. And let me read this out loud. I've never known whether you should say 1 with your foot on the sidewalk, 2 with the following foot on the first step, and so on, or whether the sidewalk shouldn't count. At the top of the steps, I fell foul of the same dilemma. In the other direction, from top to bottom, it was the same. The word is not too strong. I did not know where to begin nor where to end. That's the truth of the matter. So, of course, we have this sort of, in early Beckett's stories, especially, we have this very sort of what looks like an existentialist ontological interest in beginning and ending of life. But what is interesting here is how he's concretizing this question of beginning and ending through the operation of number. And the central dilemma is, where does the number series open? Where do we begin? Which step is step one? Is it the sidewalk when we are going up? Should we count the sidewalk as the first step? Or is the first step, to put it like that, right? So where do we begin counting? Similarly, when we go at the top of the staircase, do we count the last surface? So these problems of counting are quite central, not just to ontology. For example, in Alan Badiou's mathematical ontology, these are extremely central questions for being, for the being itself, what Badiou calls being qua being in relation to being. So there is a one, in the sense that there's a harmony. Let's say there are 10 numbers, but then there's a counting operation that counts these 10 numbers from 1 to 10, which is another 1. So there's a count of the count, which is another 1. It's a very complicated question whether we should count the 0 or not. In fact, there's been quite a bit of debate in philosophy of mathematics and also in operational mathematics whether 0 can ever be counted as a number. And we see this, for example, in Pascal's Posse, where Pascal talks about two kinds of infinity, an inductive infinity and a deductive infinity, two ideas of infinity. And as we know, Beckett was very fond of reading Pascal's Posse, and especially this particular section on geometry, which is heavily noted in Beckett's library. To go back to the point about counting, do we count the 0 or not? That seems to be a very important question. And in the book I also study, as I said, this question in relation to the way in a love relationship the question of the void becomes very important. So love is about an exchange, and at some level there is a numerical operation there. Some atomic object is exchanged between the couple, and yet it's an enigmatic object. It's an object that we do not quite know. Why do we love someone? We're not very sure exactly why. In any case, what we see in these early stories from The Expelled, if we consider the other stories up to the end, so the Carminative, the end, and also First Love, what we see in these stories is a very complex ontological hesitation, I would say, between the self and the other. And I'm going onto a slightly different track here. Of course, there's been a lot of writing on this. Jonathan Bolter has written on this. Shane Weller has written on what he calls the unethical experience in Beckett's works. I'm taking a slightly different perspective here. So what we see in this early work, contra Badiou, I would say. So Badiou has this sort of famous, slightly modular argument that before How It Is, Beckett's work is steeped in the problem of solipsism, and it does not open out to the encounter with the other, which is the domain of ethics, the self's encounter with the other. It's too preoccupied with the self. So the way Badiou reads the trilogy, especially The Unnameable, is that The Unnameable is almost like a dramatization of this Cartesian theater of torture, where the self cannot anchor itself onto another. And there's a problem of solipsism that invades the trilogy. I'm not entirely sure whether I completely agree with this reading, even though, of course, the reading has its own value and its own element of truth, of course. What we see, in fact, if we go back to some of these early texts, like the short stories, is a constant evocation of chance encounters with the other. Now, who is this other? it may not always be a human other. It could also be a non-human other. For example, the horse. The way the horse becomes a very important figure of the animal other in the Expelled is I think quite interesting, right? I mean, we have homelessness as a major theme throughout these stories, and a sort of vacillation. We also have the memory of the father, and Beckett is writing these stories after having lost his father. There's a memorialization of the father here, which I will come to at the end. But I just want to briefly spend some time on this ethical relation with the other, which is opened up through these chance encounters. For example, let's just stay with the first story, as in the Expelled. And in the Expelled, we have this particular encounter with the cab horse, right? So the expelled man, the narrator, by chance, he encounters this cabman, and he gives him some sort of a refuge, and he spends the night in the stable. But there's something disturbing about the gaze of the animal. And again, you could remember the trilogy, especially Malone Dies and Saposcat's encounters with the hen in that darkening room, or all those references to the mules who had to be put out, who had to be mercy killed. I mean, this encounter with the animal other in the early work is an interesting dimension. And again, it makes me think of that wonderful line in How It Is, head sunk, animals know. And there's this enigmatic kind of utterance in How It Is, which Mary Brighton and others have read quite a lot into, this idea that animals carry some sort of a knowledge in them, a knowledge that perhaps we do not have. Animals know. What do they know is the question. So we have this disturbing gaze of the other, in this case the animal other, and that's one of the reasons why this man has to leave the stable. What we also see in these early short stories is this preoccupation with a kind of a meta-narration. So the narrator is continuously talking about the need to tell stories, but also the failure of storytelling. And again, this is something that stays with the Beckett of the trilogy, the Beckett of Texts for Nothing, and much later, the Beckett of Fizzles, for example. I mean, this aborted storytelling, this abortive storytelling, the futility of storytelling is something that stays with him, almost like an aesthetic coda. The failure of linguistic representation is something that stays with him. So we have this idea, for example, at the end of the Expelled, we have the famous lines, "I don't know why I told this story. I could just as well have told another. Perhaps some other time I'll be able to tell another. Living souls, you will see how alike they are." So there's almost this sort of universal imagination of humanity as some sort of a uniform category, and they're quite similar. But are the horses similar? Why is the gaze of the horse disturbing for the Beckettian narrator in The Expelled? Is there something not so uniform, not so homogeneous about the animal? It's a question kind of opened up by the story, I feel. The Carminative, again, has a sort of, what one Beckett critic has called a post-mortal narration. It's a post-mortal narration. It's narrated by a corpse. And again, it would remind us of Malone, right? Malone in the hospital bed is constantly telling himself these stories, and he dies in one of these stories. I mean, famously, the novel does not return to Malone's sick bed. It ends with one of the stories. And there's this sort of, very interesting sentence we have at the end of Malone Dies, which is structured almost vertically. It's not a horizontal sentence. It's like that great last poem of Beckett's, Comment dire, what is the word, which is almost an attempt to write the same sentence over and over again. It's like folly for two, given, folly given, all this is Comment dire. And there's a sort of a rewriting, bit by bit rewriting of the same sentence, as it were. So we have that at the end of Malone Dies, for example. To come back to what I was saying, I mean, we have this sort of interest in storytelling and the abortions in storytelling. We also have that. I'll finish now. I think you're running out of time. I'll very quickly finish with this image of the father, which seems to be a pervasive presence in these early stories, all the four stories I mentioned. The death of the father, the memory of the father in First Love. The story ends with this, again, very deeply ambivalent moment where the narrator cannot, as it were, accept the partner's childbirth and abandons the partner along with the child, goes out into the starry night and remembers how the father taught him all these names of the constellations. So the father is associated with names, with metaphors, with names of stars, and he's not able to remember those names in the absence of the father. We have again a similar moment in the end and the carminative, where the father is referred to as this sort of, this bed of this sort of, source, this master narrative, as it were, of stories. So there's this sort of, again, a very enigmatic and short-circuited kind of a story never quite told, as it were, the story of Joe Brim or Joe Bryn, a story which is tangentially mentioned, and it's a bedtime story the narrator's father used to tell him. And in fact, the narrator is expelled in The Expelled because after the death of his father, he has been, thrown out of the house by the other family members. So we have this notion of homelessness, which is also associated with the death of the father. And we have again these memories of the father in the end, the short story titled The End, where the father taught the narrator the names of the mountains. So the father, and this is a very Lacanian moment in the early stories, where the father seems to be continuously associated with storytelling, with narrative, and also with nomination. The famous Lacanian notion being the name of the father. How nomination in language has a connection with the patronym, with the name of the father. So quite literally, we have this memorialization of the father through half-remembered names of constellation in First Love, and all through the three stories, we see this sort of trapping of the father's association with stories, untold, half-told, enigmatically told, or the father's relation with names. Again, not just names of constellations, but also names of mountains, which are again half-remembered, as it were. But we see this hesitation, as I was saying, a logic of encounter and a hesitation between the self and the other. There is a movement of opening towards the other, which is why I would complicate that somewhat more linear narrative Badiou would offer, that before How It Is, we don't have an encounter. I'm not entirely sure about that thesis, because there seems to be, all these bristling chance encounters in the early works, but there's also a dilemma. There's a weakness. The word weakness, recurs through these stories. There's a weakness to open oneself to the other, and there's a retraction to the self. So at that level, it's a dialectical operation between the self and the other. There is a proclivity towards the other, but then there is a sort of a retraction or a withdrawal into the self. We see this when the narrator leaves the beloved, the wife, who becomes a mother in the First Love, in the short story First Love. We also see this in the narrator's withdrawal from the stable in The Expelled, and we see this in different forms in the other two stories as well. Again, we have this very interesting encounter, another chance encounter with this little boy with a goat, and the narrator then remembers or tells himself, asks himself, will this boy ever remember this moment, this very brief moment when he chanced upon me or I chanced upon him, or both? Will he ever remember this moment with a degree of care? Perhaps he will when he grows old. I'm remembering this moment, if I'm not mistaken, from the Carminative. So we have all these chance encounters which potentially open to another, but then again sort of withdraw, as it were. So I'll finish up here, and maybe if we get the time and the opportunity to have a quick question and answer on some of these things which I presented in a somewhat non-linear montage-like way. It'll be great if we could have a conversation on top of this, and I'll be happy to address your questions. Thank you again to all of you for listening in, and thank you to James for this opportunity. It was great talking to you virtually in absentia, but nevertheless, I mean, in that absence, there's something Decadian too. So yeah, bye. Thank you so much.